We're going to be starting the program in another minute or so. We have a lot of people still logging on, and I just want to give them another moment, and then we'll begin. Okay, everyone, we're going to start our program, and first of all, what we're talking about today is designed to clear up a lot of the confusion that exists currently with the OSHA's new Silica rule, which will take effect June 23rd of this year. So it's right around the corner from us. I'm Robert Pignataro from American Compliance Systems, and what we'd like to do is just briefly show you that if you have any questions, there is a dialog box. This is an example of it. You would just enter that question in or type it in and send it. We will address questions at the end of the program so that we can have sufficient time to cover all the real important aspects of this. And what we usually do with programs like this is we circulate the questions that come in as well as questions that may come in after the program and circulate those with the answers or information to everyone, so everyone has the benefit. But any kind of questions you have, comments, etc., please feel free to send them in. We really encourage you to do that because it may be the same kind of question somebody else has. We also want to apologize to everyone who couldn't get into the program because we were oversubscribed. And we're going to have more of these because the demand is there and seems to be a lot of desire to get the real information. So we'll be conducting more of these, and we'll try to increase the capability to host more people. Anyway, an overview of what today's program is contained here. We're going to discuss about what is silica and why should you care. And just a couple of points on that. It's not just your health 20, 30, 40 years from now. And why that's important is because silica is one of those things that has an impact down the road quite a bit. That's why the new rule is in effect, because of the latent effect of exposures to illnesses. Another reason is that some companies are going to face litigation and perhaps even bankruptcy from that litigation from injured workers. This is running a parallel very much to the early days of asbestos and all the ramifications that has as more and more science came out that the bad effects of asbestos being inhaled and absorbed, much like silica, cause all kinds of health problems. And also on this is fines and penalties. OSHA is currently enforcing a silica standard, not as stringent as this new one, and they've been doing that since 1996. We'll see some of that in a bit. We're going to talk about the history of silica and the standard, a rationale for the new rule, an overview of what construction and how construction is impacted by this, as well as really some good key strategies for compliance for exposure, and how to put in place a program that is not cost prohibitive, and in addition, how to use your compliance as a vendor to win business, especially since a lot of the general contractors now have exposure with this, and many of them are looking very, very much at the compliance levels of programs that the subcontractors have. In addition, if you get people from a temp agency, many lawsuits have determined that under temp agencies, it's almost like a dual employer rule where the agency and you, the employer, or the person getting someone from a temp have the responsibility to train people. So if you're getting any of your workers from temp agencies or do over time, that is another big consideration. Okay. So this is just our standard disclaimer, and now let's take a little bit of a look at silica. Okay. The main thing, or main takeaway here, is the dust is very hazardous when the small particles are inhaled. Silica has been around for a long, long time. There's several different varieties of it. Most of the concern revolves around respirable crystalline silica, or RCS, and really it becomes a problem when somebody working with it chips, cuts, drills, grinds, creates a dust, and this can range everything from the placement of something in cement to cutting something and a whole host of activities. These dust particles can penetrate into the lungs and cause all kinds of problems. And here's just a couple of them. The thing to remember is there's not an immediate illness that kind of jumps out. It's not like, you know, I get exposed to the dust today and 3 weeks from now or next week or something, or even next year necessarily, I come down with symptoms. The latency period is in years and sometimes in decades. So what's really going to be happening, and is happening, is concern about an employee being exposed to this, coming down with something later on, and the ramifications are there. This next slide shows that there has been a program about silica, and there have been inspections going on under the National Emphasis Program. Now, these are programs that OSHA creates to look at something on a nationwide basis that they are concerned about. And this program, which started, and you'll see that on one of the next slides, in 1996, so it's over 20 years in existence, it has been updated to coincide with the new standard. This next paragraph, though, is very, very telling. And I advise everyone that is doing any kind of work to really be aware of this, because what it's saying is during the course of an inspection, an OSHA inspection at a work site, if that site falls within any of the SIC codes, meaning that there's any kind of work that this Appendix B slide will show you, they are directing the inspector to also focus on any activity that potentially, not actually, potentially exposes employees to silica. And on the next slide, we have a list, which are basically most every one of the construction categories, from general contractors of single-family homes to residential buildings other than that, to industrial contractors, highway, street, bridge, tunnel, water, sewer, pipeline, heavy construction, and then a lot of the trades: painting, paper hanging, masonry, stone, plaster, drywall, roofing, sheet metal, concrete, excavation, wrecking and demo, and a number of specialty trade contractors. And you could be there doing something at the other end of the work site, and what this is saying is if OSHA inspector is there inspecting for something else not related to you, they are instructed to look at the site for activities that could include silica exposure. Now, here's some of the tasks that commonly create exposures above the limit. And we'll get into this in a little bit without getting too sciencey, because there's a very, very good track to take to make this a whole lot simpler than it might ordinarily be. But first, let's look at, these are some of the activities: drilling, grinding, setting duct pipe, jackhammers, tuck pointing, crushing stone, demo, sanding drywall. Again, these aren't all of them, these are just some of them, but these are the ones that usually create an exposure over the limits or action levels that OSHA wants. The next slide is just quickly looking at silica has been a concern, and there's been action around it for quite some time, looking back to the mid-90s. The reason and as we said a little bit earlier, there was an emphasis program that's been in existence since '96, which is updated to coincide with this new rule. And the reason it's been of concern is because of the health effects. The new rule is really talking about exposure levels and that they want to come down before more and more people, which there's a lot of science about from many, many research organizations over the past 20-something years that clearly show that silica exposure creates some very significant health issues, cancers, etc. The next slide is just a little bit of a conversation or some points about the old level, and it was used to estimate the employee's exposure in an air monitoring sample. This has come down quite a bit. This was very confusing, by the way, for a lot of people to deal with. General industry has to deal with it. Construction, as you'll see in a few minutes, has a very clear and simple path. So the next slide is going to show us a bit about the rationale for the new rule. And as I was saying just a minute or so ago, the original one was based on studies from the 60s and earlier. And silica, respiratory crystalline silica, has since been identified as a human carcinogen. And there's many, many studies linking that lung cancer and silicosis are occurring at levels well below the original levels of 100. And now those levels have been reduced in half to 50, and an action level, furthermore, has been set at 25. We'll kind of walk through some of this. This next slide shows that. And I don't want to dwell too much on this right now because there is a very simple, much less expensive path forward for everyone in construction. And it's really, to me, a very big benefit that we are strongly urging everyone in the construction scene to take advantage of. And we'll discuss that starting with our next review of the steps. Okay, there's basically 8 steps, 8 things that you have to do to develop, implement, and maintain a compliant program. And the first one is to determine exposure levels, and in this, OSHA gives you the very big benefit. Determine exposure levels. That could be done by industrial hygiene air monitoring, where you're monitoring the individual worker or workers doing a task and determining the levels they're exposed to. Or there's a simple table to use that lists 18 different tasks that are done in construction and says if you follow these recommendations, you don't have to do the air monitoring. So for most of you out there in construction, that's going to save many thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of dollars on air sampling and evaluations, etc., to get to the same place. And we're going to cover this, each one of these in a lot more detail. You then develop a written exposure control plan. The next step is to designate someone who is a competent person. You need to train supervisors and workers on communication of the hazards of silica and how to limit exposures. You have to have specific engineering controls, such as water or ventilation, to limit exposure. Providing respirators when engineering controls cannot adequately limit exposure. You need to limit worker access to high exposure areas, provide medical exams to highly exposed workers, and then you need to keep records of all of this, including medical exams. Now, all this has to be in place, not starting, but be in place by June 23rd this year. So construction employers are required to comply with all obligations of the standard. And as you walk through them, you'll see there's a fair amount of things that have to be done under each area. Okay, we really want to talk about the best strategies for compliance. We've been dealing with OSHA and regulations for over 27 years now, and this one is no different in how complex it really is. We have and we'll give you materials that you can have as part of this program. This is just one of them. This is the entire standard of this final rule. And note there, it's over 600 pages. So for those of you who have trouble sleeping at night, I don't know if you're going to need the Zipa to prevent this snoring. You may want to take this standard and read it. What we've done here is we've kind of combed through that, and this program is giving you the key aspects of that and the key points you need to be in compliance. Okay, so the best strategies include our key 8 areas, which we just went through, from exposure to then developing a plan and then doing a number of things to implement and maintain that plan, that program, which basically follows the core way this is done with regard to most OSHA regulations. The first one, which is the biggest, I'll call it benefit, if you follow path B or option 2. There's 2 ways to determine the exposure. Way 1, which we do not advise you doing, it's complex, it's expensive, and it's ongoing, because you have to do initial monitoring of the workers and the tasks. You have to then repeat that monitoring periodically and monitoring following changes in the work environment, which for most everyone in construction changes on a pretty regular basis, depending upon a number of variables at one construction site to another. It's not that you're just doing the same task. There can be, excuse me, other conditions at the site that create exposure. The other option, which we really are going to cover in detail, is it's a gift in what I've seen over the years from OSHA, because OSHA generally defines in a very nebulous way, as long as you avoid exposures and do this and do that, without telling you, hey, if you do this and this and this, you're in compliance, you're following the rule. This is what Table 1 does, and it does it for 18 tasks, showing equipment, specified engineering controls, work practices, and the respiratory protection required for each task. So that's the recommended one. Option 1, air monitoring. This is just here for informational purposes. We're really not going to focus much on this, because the cost of this is well beyond the feasibility and probably the financial wherewithal of most companies. So for your exposure, we really now want to turn to Table 1, which is the preferred way. OSHA's already done a good amount of the legwork and identified procedures to put into place to ensure any silica dust levels remain within the PEL. Or in other words, if you're following Table 1, an employer doesn't have to measure their workers' exposure and are not subject to the various PELs. It's like you follow this and you're doing the right thing. And we're going to look at now just one task that they've identified. We'll show you a reprint of that, and as part of your program materials, all of you will receive the multi-page list of all 18 of the tasks. But let's say you're using operating handheld power saw. You need to use saws equipped with integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade. You need to operate that saw and maintain it in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions to minimize dust emissions. Then you follow the required respiratory protection, and the standards for that assign this thing called an APF, which is assigned protection factor. What that really means is it's a number. In this case, it's 10, and you need to have a respirator or dust mask that matches that, and any place you get them from will have all that information. Okay, so that's the simple way. This is a little bit about what the more complex way is, where you can see that you're looking at monitoring, you're looking at protecting, you're then getting back to the very things that are already been outlined, but you're first doing thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars of expensive industrial hygiene evaluation and repeating it. This next slide shows an actual reprint from the table. This is what the table looks like, and this is called Table 1, which means follow this and you do the other parts 2 to 8 and you're in compliance. So, handheld power saws, any blade diameter. I use it with a water delivery. I operate it according to the manufacturer's instructions. And then if my shift is less than 4 hours and it's used outdoors, I don't have a respiratory requirement. If it's used outdoors above 4 hours, I do have a respiratory requirement. And this type of respirator is a very simple, very inexpensive one, and you'll see a couple of flavors towards the latter part of this program. It's not much money, anywhere from a couple bucks per employee per mask or respirator to as little as $1, depending on the volume you buy. So this is really something that can help you quite a bit. Okay, so strategy-wise, option 1. Okay, table 1, excuse me, option 2. Avoid option 1. Option 2, which is table 1. And then you're still required to do the other items 2 through 8, which we'll now take a look, because these are the key requirements. And as we look at each in more detail, do understand that there is a simple way to pull all this together. We have a program here that's available to all contractors that contains all of this and helps you in a great way, and I'll give you an idea of some of the costs of that towards the end of this. All right, let's look at our exposure control plan. As we were saying, when you comply with most anything in the realm of OSHA, workplace safety, regulatory-wise, you first look at what's the exposure, what's the thing that can injure or hurt the employee. You then are required to write a plan of how you're going to eliminate or control the exposures. In this case, it's a written exposure control plan for silica. It has to have certain key things in it. Identify the task that creates the exposure. Okay, that's working with a saw. That's the task. Okay, and any respiratory protection used to limit exposures. Well, the plan would key into and tie into the tables or to the type of respiratory protection your employees get. The plan must also indicate housekeeping, such as no dry sweeping or blowing the area clear with compressed air, which is going to spread all of these microscopic particles all over the place, and how silica exposure is limited or there's warnings about it. And all these procedures need to be there to access work areas where, restrict access to these areas. In some cases, there may be a procedure where something's going on that you or your company is doing, and you put up barriers to eliminate that dust from coming into contact with other workers, which is another big area here. It's not just the exposure of your employees, but if you're doing things that are exposing other employees, that creates a big problem. And that plan must be reviewed annually. Next thing you have to do is designate a competent person. Now, a lot of times when we say this, people go, what's a competent person? Well, in loose terms, it's someone who by education or awareness or experience kind of knows what should be done. That person needs to be able to identify existing and foreseeable hazards. They need to be trained and up to date on the standard. That individual at the work site would implement the plan would conduct routine observations of dust tasks, and is authorized to take action when necessary, if there's dust or if there's issue. This could be any one of your employees. We've created a program tied to this that will bring someone from just, a basic, I'll call it, working individual, to be able to function as a competent person in this arena. You don't need a PhD in OSHA rules or regulations and Silica to be a competent person. So it's a pretty straightforward way to get somebody in your employment to be a competent person. Training. You also have to train the staff, the employees, supervisors. That training needs to contain a piece about it that's part of the hazard communication standard with regard to labeling on containers and safety data sheets on Silica. And that would show an individual how to find information about exposure to Silica and what it can cause. So there's some brushing up, if you will, on your hazard communication training that would really coincide with the emphasis on Silica. And this is where supervisors and workers are receiving a lot of their training on health hazards associated with exposure. Tasks where employees might be exposed. What kind of controls do you have in place? Again, this would be done at the site by your competent person who would be identified. The contents of the standard needs to be available, and a purpose and description of the medical surveillance program, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Exposure control methods. I mean, this is really, in OSHA, whenever there is an exposure to something that can make somebody ill or injure them, the first look at is, can we put some kind of engineering controls? Can we block the process from exposing the hazards of that process to the employees? And such as isolating the worker, putting up a wall, putting up a barrier in front of the worker. Well, in a lot of cases, that's just not feasible. I mean, because I can't work on the wall and put the thing in that I'm trying to do, even if that's an electrical outlet or a plumbing outlet, without cutting into the wall if I'm doing that from behind a barrier that I can't put my saw through. And so some of the controls that are described, and in that table 1, by the way, there are given, like a saw with water is a method of engineering control. So installing local exhaust ventilation systems, using wet methods for cutting, chipping, drilling, using HEPA-equipped vacuums, which are very common with asbestos. Again, this is to get out those fibers, not to blow them around or sweep them around and get them in the air all over. Not using compressed air, and substituting where possible, which is going to be very, very tough because Silica, crystalline silica, is in so many things, from paints to coatings to finishings to cement to drywall to patchings to many, many different things. So there's also some administrative controls that part of that is considered employee training. So you can see that the control side has some pretty clear-cut items in it. Okay, the next slide is really starting to get into now respiratory protection. So I've tried to eliminate or control the exposure. I've done the basic things I can, or as we said earlier, just do what it says on table 1 for the task being used of the 18 that are there. So I use my saw. I then have respirators, because even using those saws with the wet saws, there still can and will be dust, and so I need respirators. The high-end are air purifying, supplied air. There's some very basic respirators, a lot of people call them dust masks, of a certain type. You got to make sure you have the right type, which are very inexpensive. Those are okay to use as long as they meet the rating. You also need to have the respiratory protection program in place, which you should have, but if you don't, you need to get that, and you need to train the workers on respiratory protection awareness and fit testing, and you need to make sure that you have records of all of that. So, employees working near operations, and this is so important. You have an employee. That employee is doing something that is not creating silica dust. They're, let's say, just connecting some wires, or they're just carrying some materials to site. If they are in an area where silica dust is generated, they may very much need respiratory protection. And so that's something a lot of people say, well, my guy was just walking through there. Well, that individual, even when they're only walking through there, need to have respiratory protection. And in most cases, that's going to be a simple dust mask or a simple half-face shield, which now you'll see many of the general contractors are requiring proof that the vendors and subcontractors coming on site are able to substantiate that they have a very robust and compliant program in place, because they really share exposure and liability. And we'll talk a little bit about that soon as to how compliance with this can really be used as a marketing tool. But be aware that it's not just you and your workers and what they're doing. You have to really think about what's really going on at that site. In the earlier case, we saw that if OSHA's there doing an inspection, they see silica issues could be there or determine that. They do an inspection, they see one of your people walking through a place where there's obviously or potentially silica dust, your company could be cited for an OSHA violation, as well as the general contractor who's running that job that you're on. So it's very significant, and it's getting more and more attention now from general contractors, property owners, etc. Okay, limiting workers' access is intended to eliminate exposure also to unprotected bystanders. This is just kind of, we don't want to beat this to death, but be aware that there is a lot of language in this regulation, in this rule, that is talking about people, many times they're not maybe directly exposed by the task, but they're peripherally exposed. So they're walking through, working in and about the area, or the dust that are not contained for a variety of reasons are blowing into that area. And all of those will and can create gaps or violations. And it's not just the violation that's the big issue here, even though OSHA fines and penalties are off the charts as far as how large they're becoming for even the smallest of companies. But it's really the concern about litigation, which is just starting to rear its ugly head with this. Posting signs and using barriers are other ways to limit worker access. Here's an example of a sign on this next type of program. Again, these are easy, simple fixes that help keep you in compliance. Now, this next area of medical surveillance. When you read through the rule, it talks about that you have to do initial or periodic medical exam. And when they say make it available, it's like you are required to make it available. This is a cost that is solely borne by the employer. And it really is tied around how often the employee is required to wear a respirator. So again, table 1, you kind of look at the chart and determine from that chart what type of respirator protection level and how, so anybody doing that task, as we saw, if it's more than 4 hours, they need to wear a respirator with APF 10, which is equivalent to a half-face one or a N95 or so dust mask, okay? If that employee wears it, this is the next question for, well, how long? Is that like 8 hours? Is that 5 hours? And the answer is, if that employee wears it for any time during the day, 5 minutes, takes it off, doesn't wear it again for the rest of the day, that counts as 1 day of respirator use. So be aware that if you're looking at tasks that an employee might have to wear for, let's say, 2 hours, and if that employee either wears it for, once they hit that trigger point of 30 days, or it's very likely, because of what they do, that they're going to wear a respirator more than 30 days out of the full calendar year, then you have to follow the medical surveillance, which is an exam within the first 30 days of assignment and every 3 years after that. The exam needs to be conducted by a physician or other licensed healthcare professional. The exam needs to include a measure of their respiratory system. X-rays are generally included. And then there's an opinion that comes back as to the ability for that individual to work at that job task, to wear a respirator, and a number of other things. This is in the standard, but it's also so very important because much like asbestos, which came on and came on and came on, and then all of a sudden the legal community got out there, and there's so many lawyers advertising with, call this 800 number if you think you've been injured by this, and we'll sue and get you a whole bunch of money. There's going to be a lot of this that's going to be seen, and it's something that every employer should really look at, getting an initial or baseline evaluation or even a brief history of what that employee did before, how long they did it, and wherever they work, was there any type of protection afforded to them? Because even though OSHA says this is not intended to create an exposure for employees, well, that's OSHA's intent, but you could take this to the bank. That's not going to be the intent of the contingency lawyer going after a large sum of money against a company that lawyer is representing the plaintiff or the injured current or former disgruntled employee. And we've seen the same thing over the years with so many other areas. And the Achilles heel is, when you're attacked in such a situation as that, it's like, okay, did you comply with this federal law? Let me see the proof of this. Not, oh, yeah, we did that. Okay, prove it to me. Show me the training. Show me this. Show me that. Did you ever, determine that my client didn't get this from you? And this then gets to be a big, long argument. And even if you argue and win, it's going to cost you 6 figures up for just the legal fees involved with a defense like this, because of who's going to have to do what, and on and on and on and on. So the medical surveillance part of this is something to really focus on. It's not something that has to be so terribly cost-wise draconian. There's some, basic ways to do it, to not only comply, but to protect yourself. And for any of those of you that want follow-up, just give us a buzz. Okay, the last topic is maintain records. These would be records of, okay, I follow table 1. I did this on this job for all my employees. They had the respiratory. They had the saws with the water and this and that. We followed all the instructions. I have the safety data sheets that I received either from the people that I bought the material from or that were part and parcel of the project safety data sheets for the type of substances being used, or this is what the contractor across the way who is doing something that exposed my workers, this is what they were using. Now, many of these records that we're talking about comprise something called employee exposure records. And OSHA has had this regulation for many, many years, and it requires you, the employer, to keep these type of exposure records for 30 years. It's not a typo. It's 30 years after employment ceases. So you take the last day of employment and you count 30 years in a day, and that's how long you have to keep the records. This is really I often refer to it as the longest record-keeping requirement known to mankind. Maybe the only other thing might be the 10 Commandments or something, but I don't know if those are actually records. Okay, the right respirator. This thing about assigned protection, that's really, as we described before, an assigned level. The simple thing to do that for most of the tasks on the chart, on the table, something with an APF 10. And those two respirators on the left there are APF 10. Now, for those of you who have table 1, or will get it at the end of this, most of the tasks, APF 10 satisfies the protection. There is only one instance that I think I'm aware of where it's an APF 25. All right, so what it's saying is a half-face cartridge or a disposable dust mask, NIOSH approved, are okay for most of the tasks. All right, so you're not going to have to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on supplied air and this and that, which, by the way, in some cases, these are the minimum protection levels. If you have something that's available and affords more than that, well, that's okay too. So for most of these, we're talking the half face and the dust mask. For many, many of the tasks, it'll cover a lot of it. Okay. These are more examples of it. And here's some of the prices. Some folks are charging a lot, and some of these, the dust masks, by the way, like a 3M has different codes. They're color-coded, like the little things, the straps are color-coded. Most, if I remember correctly, of the blue type and other colors fit this requirement. High-end would be 7 to 10. I've seen them as little as 80 cents when you buy them in bulk. So they shouldn't be too much money. The cartridge half-face ones, there's disposable ones that are in the couple of dollars a plus, so we're giving you the high end of the ranges, and those are kind of just some of the other areas for those respirators. Again, some of the associations and group we're working with are talking to various suppliers about support and help on this, or being able to get a package together. We'll communicate any of that information with you. So, okay, we're coming to really the key part. What do you do with all this? Okay, here's the 8 things you have to do. And so we're going to take the option with the table. That's the simple one. That saves us all that upfront money of testing and evaluation. We're going to follow that. Then you got to develop the plan, designate a competent person or competent people, train them so that they know what to do and how to fulfill that role, train your supervisors and staff, use the specific methods. That's already outlined on table 1, so number 5 is done there. You're going to limit access to high exposure areas with a barrier, a sign, or a warning. Or if the person is in a high exposure area, they have to have the appropriate respiratory protection. That's limiting that. The medical surveillance is going to be a basic evaluation with an X-ray and lung function, and then maintain the records, which is keeping records, keeping track of what people are exposed to. Now, some of the other benefits that we talked about earlier, some of the reasons to do this is more and more general contractors and property owners are requiring audits of a company safety program, very strong proof that a vendor has done what they're supposed to do to be in compliance. Why? Because they have liability exposure in hiring you or in you working on their site. And this has a very long and involved and circuitous path to liability and exposure. Being exposed to silica and coming down with an illness or being diagnosed, potentially diagnosed as someone who got this, and the linkage of that to the type of work somebody did creates many, many headaches and concerns. So those are two things. Also, more and more, there's the CSIP type of projects where all of the folks are operating under one umbrella insurance program, usually for liability and workers' comp. And what that does is that ties all of the safety and all of the exposures and all of the actions of the general contractor and all of the subcontractors on that work site under one policy. It's very good in that it affords savings. There is a lot of exposure if there's unsafe vendors or vendors creating situations that can hurt people, because a lot of times these policies are funded, or there's a first amount that's funded by the general contractor. So having a good program, being able to demonstrate that you have a good program in place and showing that to a general contractor, we've seen more and more instances where that helps the vendor win a job. It will also help you in insurance, because workplace injuries and illnesses very often end up in payments under workers' compensation insurance. And it's not going to take too long or too many cases down the road for workers' comp insurance rates to go up for certain types of companies where this is becoming a bigger problem, and this is going to really start to come on down the road. So what we've seen many times is, even though that's it, you can demonstrate you have a better program. You could demonstrate by that you have altered your risk profile for your company, and that's why, quite frankly, you should get a better rating and a better cost structure for your workers' comp. Even though you're doing the same thing as somebody else, across the way, by being able to demonstrate compliance in a program in place and monitored, you will be able to create quite a few savings. So the last thing we just really want to focus on, I told you at the beginning of this, and we call this the ACS answer. Okay, you use table 1, and then you do 2 through 8. Now, to give you an idea, we've created a turnkey package for 2 to 8 that we give you an OSHA compliant plan. We have a program online and in web seminar fashion to train your people to be a competent person and retrain them throughout the year. We have employee training and seminars to do the following for your supervisors and managers. The table of what to follow is there. We stand ready to aid, guide, and assist you, email, phone, smartphone device, etc., to show you what to do at every step for the table. The training will show you how to limit your access. The medical surveillance details we follow with you and help aid, guide you, and we have embedded in this kind of a worksheet that you could track your employees and the triggers for when they hit that 30-day level. And what we have is our universal record keeping system, cloud-based system, which lets you access all of this and your training and your reports and all your records for the company and for every work site, if you want to set it up that way that you're on. Now, the cost for that is not a budget breaker. It's $1,200 a year. For those of you who are accessing this seminar or working through any one of our insurance agency partners, your cost is $960 a year. So that's just an example. That's a 20% savings, by the way. Instead of like $100 a month, it's really the equivalent of $80 a month to do the math for you. So, again, it doesn't have to be a budget breaker for this compliance. Construction industry is really going to be in the crosshairs, and the big concern is not necessarily OSHA or fears of an OSHA inspection and citations. It's really going to be the litigation and the fines. And over the years, we work with a lot of owners and managers of companies who have been through the ringer when litigation arises, because it can literally take everything that's been built up over many, many years. So that completes the basic part of our program. As we said earlier, for those that couldn't get in, we'll try to increase the size for future ones, and we'll have future ones. We'll keep everybody posted and aware of that. We'll go through a few questions as people have them and as time permits. And remember, even if after this program you find a question or so that you didn't think of now or want to ask, just send it on in, and we will reproduce all the questions and give you the answers. If after the program too you have it, we have 800 number, emails, etc. Just feel free to contact us. We're here to help you. So, Karen, do we have any?
So we have, will this rule be delayed by the new administration?
Okay, that's a good question. From some rules have been delayed under the new administration, and this one probably will not be. If perchance it does get delayed, like some have been pushed off for like 30 to 60 days. There's been no news I've seen on any of the wire services or any indication of any of the regulatory bodies that it's likely that this one will be. The other side is that just a simple recommendation, whether or not this comes now or a little bit later, it's going to come. And the exposure and the problems that an injured employee or an employer can face due to an injured or exposed employee, my best advice would be I wouldn't wait. I would, as soon as possible, implement a program. It's going to show your company as a more compliant, better risk profile company to work on a project, to get a bid, to win a job. And it's also going to insulate you from down the road issues and problems that you inherit, by the way, when you hire somebody who worked at some other place and they had no type of protection ever, and now there's a problem, and that falls to you. So the other question that we get too with that, and I don't know if that one's coming, but a lot of times in these we get the one about the medical surveillance. And again, just to reiterate, that question comes up, 30 days, and how much time during the day does my employee have to wear a respirator for that to count as a day towards the total of 30? And again, the answer to that is any amount of time. In the table 1, it gives you the type of protection if it's less than 4 hours on a shift or more than 4 hours on a shift. That in no way correlates to how you count a day towards the 30 days needed for medical surveillance. So again, that could be minutes. It could be 10 minutes a day that somebody wears a respirator, doesn't wear it for the rest of the day, that counts as 1 day. So if you think going into it that your employees are just readily going to have that, then they should be, you need to start putting them through the medical surveillance program. That's pretty much the way that one is. Now, again, compliance dates, and there's a lot of different dates. Some people say, well, I thought that was next year. Construction has to start, and not start, construction, the way the wording of this is all of those covered employees, which means anybody with any type of process or working on any type of a job site where there's exposure to silica must be in compliance by June 23 of this year. Okay, this is April, you got May, and then you got a couple of weeks in June. You need to be in compliance. The method of sampling analysis takes effect a year later. However, I really cannot see why anybody would follow that, because it's far easier and cheaper, and you're going to get to the same place anyway, to follow Table 1. Now, there's a different set of guidelines for manufacturers. Their dates kick in next June. And part of the rationale behind that was the exposures in construction have been deemed to be, from all the research by these various bodies, much more prevalent and of much more concern in construction industry. So that then ends our program. Anyone have any comments or questions, please feel free to send them in. We do appreciate your time. We're here. Our main purpose is to provide information. That program that we mentioned that's available to contractors at those price points is really not the main mission of this. The main mission of this is to give you information, but we felt that we should put it there to let you know that there is an answer, and the answer is very budget friendly. And we'll send you flyers and information as part of this with all the pieces of that. And so if you're interested, we can talk to you. If you need certain parts of that and you have others, we could certainly accommodate you there or push you in a direction. Okay, here's another question. Is there a copy of a contractor compliance document? Yes, that we could send. We have that. That is in your materials, and it's the kind of official contractor compliance PDF that OSHA has put out, excerpted from the 600 plus pages of the final standard. So just so you know, we will get that contractor compliance document. We will get everyone a copy of Table 1. We'll get, what's in the slide are the categories that are covered, so that's there. Those are probably the big three. If there's any more information needed, let us know. We're almost timed out on this, so we're going to have to get off, but again, feel free, call, email, text, whatever, and we'll get you all of that. Okay, so I think we might be able to get, here's one. If the company is compliant, does that mean our subcontractors have to be as well for us to pass inspection? Okay. Looks like this question is routed in general contractor because they're subcontractors. So for the general contractor to be in compliance, everything that the general contractor is doing and everything that the subcontractors hired by the general contractor are doing must be in compliance. OSHA has this dual employer kind of doctrine, which basically says if there is something that's a violation, so if a subcontractor very specifically is not in compliance, that general contractor is not in compliance. And both can and usually will be cited. So there's two issues. There's an OSHA exposure issue, and then there's a litigation issue, because if that general contractor is allowing the subcontractor to work in a non-compliant way, it may also mean that that non-compliant subcontractor is exposing other workers from other subcontractors to issue, and this gets into a very big problem. But basically, for the JC to be compliant means that any and all subcontractors have to be compliant. And that's where our program, the record-keeping portion in particular, has been used because many times a GC is going to want to not spend hours and hours and hours and hundreds of administrative hours fussing through all these things to see if the contractor is compliant. Our program provides the ability to send that right to the GC electronically. So they can see your program, they can see your training, they can see what you're doing to monitor that, and that's where it becomes not just a compliance tool, but also a marketing tool as well. Okay. Okay. So that ends it. Thanks all of you for your time. We'll keep you posted on some of the things we said and additional programs.